Welcome to Valor Conversations. I'm your host, Jay Trainer. Valor Conversations is powered by CSB Ministries and is the official podcast of Christian Service Brigade. For more information, please visit csbministries.org. And now, on with the show. Joining me on the line is a former board member for CSB Ministries, Chuck Stecker, who I had the privilege and the honor of meeting back in ISI Rochester a couple of years ago. And I don't know if you remember that, Chuck, but the 3 a.m. friend conversation that you had was such a great keynote, a great conversation that you presented to the men that were in attendance. Let's talk, Chuck. Your connection with CSB Ministries. Where did you get started? How did you get hooked in?
Well, through the National Coalition of Ministries to Men, many years ago, a former president of CSB, Don Patterson, who is now a great friend, realized that CSB, you could get all of the boys that you could possibly handle, but it really needed to be a men's ministry to recruit men to impact the lives of these young boys. So it was through that process, through Don, another president after that, and now Scott Hyma, that the relationship developed. I had the opportunity to speak at several CSB events and then CSB sponsored events. And I do remember that Rochester ISI, Jay. Boy, what a great time. And what many that were there that are listening. The last session was done, the Power of a Lifelong Friend was done with my good friend Dan Erickson, who is now in heaven. And he got promoted to heaven the year after we did that in Rochester. And it was just an incredible time there. So that's really been a many year relationship that I've had with CSB. I'm a huge fan of CSB.
That's awesome. And so you talk about intergenerational discipleship that we are about with as a ministry with CSB Ministries, with Christian Service Brigade. Hey, when did you become passionate about the power that is involved with relationships, especially of the intergenerational variety? Let's talk about that together for a little bit.
Yeah. I think there's some things that God kind of seeps into your life, and there's not this moment where the switch is flipped per se. Okay. And I think a large part of it is we had been in the Washington, D.C. area in a church there. And I feel that one of my gifts is teaching, and I had offered to teach a Sunday school class for the church that we attended. Ended up the second year there with fifth graders, and then we ended up with fifth and sixth. But coming out of that was seeing these young people and the need for relationship, and we probably had 8 different schools represented there. So we launched a youth ministry for fifth and sixth graders called Children of Light. And there was so much, and I tell people very honestly, those young people taught me more than I taught them. So it began a process there, and I'd always been involved in coaching and with our sons and, so forth. And so you see all of the things that God kind of puts in place, and then all of a sudden you realize he's taken you to a point you didn't realize you were actually getting to. And so when we were at Promise Keepers, then after the military, I saw the need for, and we did at the church there as well, for men's ministry that would impact generations to generations. And it was probably the year 2000, so 21 years ago, that in the ministry, we went from just rites of passage per se to say, wait a minute, this is about developing a transformational intergenerational culture within ministries, within churches, things like that. So I would tell you, really the year 2000 was when you kind of hung it all up and said, all right, here's what it is. It's about a transformational intergenerational culture within each of these organizations.
So you've been on this mission specifically for 21 years. And again, a lot of the formational things happened ahead of time towards this deep rooted passion. What are you seeing today, both in society and maybe in church life with regard to intergenerational relationships, and maybe talk to the fact about some of the failures and some of the success stories that are happening in culture today, or from your own personal experiences?
Yeah. Boy, that's a tremendous question, Jay, and I think it's one that we need to address in the local church and we need to address in ministries. But here's what I'm seeing. Overlay on top of everything with our culture right now, overlay on top of it this pandemic and whatever this demic is, you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
That has drawn and isolated people away from each other. And we're seeing this breakout in a sense of people saying, man, you don't realize what you had until you lost it. Okay. So this idea of these young people being around, you take it for granted, things like that. And then all of a sudden you've got families that can't even connect in groups larger than 6 and, stuff like that. And one of the things that I'm seeing right now is a great hunger with young people to just get together with older people who will invest in them. And as we're doing this podcast, it's interesting. This morning I met with a young man in his 20s who's getting ready to get married. I had a conversation earlier in the week with another young person significantly younger than I am. I started looking, I was at my favorite coffee shop, Christian coffee shop around the corner. And I told her, I'm here three more times next week. Okay. And those 3 times are with a man who wants to talk about writing and publishing, with a young lady who graduated from high school 2 or 3 years ago now, finding her way. And then this young man that's ready to get, and there is just this incredible hunger that young people have for somebody that is older, that's willing to sit, listen, be available, and invest in them.
And on that note, you have said one of the most powerful forces on earth here in this world is the invested life, right? And so what ages are you referring to in that context with regard to the invested life?
Wow. Okay. So in the last month, I've had lunch with a young lady, 14 years old, with her parents' permission. Obviously that it was just her and I to have lunch together. But, her mother said absolutely, and so forth, as she's trying to just finished her freshman year in high school. And that goes all the way up to earlier this week. I had breakfast with a man who just turned 80 years old, and just again, wanting to process life and some things going on both in his business world, his ministry world, and his family. Now, picture that. Okay. So in the course of a month, I have probably met with a dozen people, to include a couple in Germany that my wife and I meet with that are getting ready, and others. I would say we call adulthood is when God changes the body, makes it capable of reproducing life, Jay. That really happens at 13. And that's kind of my age, at about 13 right there, to meet with them, freshmen in high school, if that's the desire, right? Gosh, 4 of these young ladies, my wife and I had over for dinner a couple of months ago. They just wanted to get together and hang. Now, get this, it was a school night. They got here at 5 o'clock, and at about 10 o'clock, one of them said, Mr. Chuck, what time's your guys' normal bedtime? And I said, you've already missed it by an hour. They left at 10:30 and weren't ready to leave. We listened to music, we talked, all of these different things and so forth. So I think that idea of that invested life, and it's just so powerful. And I would encourage everyone listening here, Jay, just take a few minutes and think about the people that invested in you at different seasons of your life. Just think about that. And to remember that the power of that invested life is made possible because your life has given you what you need to invest in another life. You're already qualified.
It's interesting to see how you at 73, 74, if I can say that, well, I just did, are involved in youth ministry. And it is a youth ministry that is not programmatic. It's a youth ministry that is not entertainment driven. It's Christ centered. Why don't you speak to that a little bit with regard to the importance of that element of incarnational ministry of presence with young people today?
Gosh, this would have been 150 years ago. My wife and I went through a course while we were assigned to the 2nd Ranger Battalion up at Fort Lewis, Washington. It was called Lifestyle Evangelism. There was so much involved in that the evangelism in your life takes place very often organically, and it's just while you're doing life. So the idea of saying, well, youth ministries, it's really a relational ministry to be available and so forth. And, Jay, as we talk about it, one of the things is a great friend of mine who's probably a decade older than I am, sent me an email last week asking if there was any way I'd meet with his granddaughter that's in the area. So it's just because of relationships. And by the way, we're meeting next week, and just to kind of help encourage her and so forth. And let me just tell you something as I'm saying this, because I think this is very, very important, and listen carefully. The fact that God leads you to meet with somebody, you still must do it in a manner that honors God and doesn't put things at risk. So I have talked about meeting with a young lady, 14. I had her mother's permission. We met publicly. I've talked about meeting with this and this and so forth. For example, the young lady that my friend said, would you meet with? We are both meeting, driving there separately, arrive at the same place. We will have coffee at this place in a public environment. My wife knows, obviously her grandfather knows, and so forth. And there's permission all around. So we must regard relationships in a Christ-like manner. And, he says, don't do anything that could even be considered by others looking on. So for anybody listening out there, and I know CSB has done such a great job, with this discipleship ministry through activities, which is how boys, young men, and all of us respond. But if you meet with them offline, outside that group, and gentlemen, if you're doing this with a young man, parents' permission, right? Things of that nature and so forth, and make sure we're doing this in a manner that can never be suspect and put at risk. So I just wanted to get that disclaimer in there, on that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a full disclosure, right?
Yes, it is.
Full authenticity, non-secretive in nature, and
Yes.
that way people can know and answer. No, I know at 10:30, I know at 11 o'clock, this is where you were at such and such time, because we want to be above reproach. That being said, too, and I think that leads into a good follow-up question as well. What's the greatest obstacle to developing true intergenerational relationships? And you've already hinted on that with regard to the publicity or the public meeting that needs to transpire. What are some other obstacles that you witness and see out there?
Let me speak to this from the encore generation, Jay. I don't like the word seniors on it. I don't know what that really means. The encore generation is really what we refer to, this generation of folks that culture has said we've done our main performance, and so forth. It was one of the reasons we wrote the book, If You Pass Your Baton, Take It Back. It was this idea that pass the baton, step out of the way, you're done. That we refer to this generation as the encore, meaning that, and think about an encore, and you and I both, we've been to concerts, and man, when it's over and you're sitting there and you're at that high, there's an encore, and there's some elements about it. One is the performer has to be ready for it. They know what they're going to do if called back on the stage. They know what they're really good at. And many times they save their best stuff for the encore. And people say, why would they do that? And I said, for this reason. That's the last thing you'll remember about the concert. Think about it. And you can talk about, yeah, they did all of these, but when they came back for that encore, the excitement level was higher than any of the others. And it was some of their best stuff, right? I think that's true with, as you said, I'm 73, be 74 here shortly. I think the biggest obstacle for the encore generation is too many of us feel like we're either disqualified or unqualified. And the unqualified comes from, part of it is because as a culture, Jay, we have so professionalized life coaching and mentoring. You go through mentoring classes and you go through these life coaches and get your own website and what you have to do to be qualified, right? And if you talk to somebody my age and say, hey, by the way, tell me about your coaches growing up, our question will be, which sport? We didn't associate it with somebody that would meet with us and kind of guide us along the path. So this is new to our generation in a sense, okay? Right. So when we see it laid out, Jay, the biggest problem that you have to encourage, particularly this wealth that we have in the encore generation that is looking now, as Bob Beal, I think, wrote it and said, we've gone from looking for success to looking for significance. And so to tie in that aspect of significance is going to be, man, what are the relationships in your life and who are you pouring into and who are you investing in? So we've got to get over the fact of feeling unqualified or disqualified because of our mistakes. And Jay, we might as well say it for the encore generation that's listening. The fact that your children aren't turning out the way that you thought you raised them, which, by the way, is a huge number, that they thought they raised them in church and now they've stepped away. They're not raising their grandkids the way they thought they raised their kids. That doesn't disqualify you from investing in another life.
And that is so the obstacle or the mental obstacle that people need to move over. Men, women, all people need to move past and get through in terms of that, if I can say it, shame. Is that fair?
Yes.
That role of shame and that role of fear that plays a role in our mindset, the what if type of scenario.
Yeah.
Um,
Jay, along that, just remember this, because what you touched on needs to be said over and over, in the sense that what Satan tries to do is bring guilt to result in shame. Satan's plan is not to make us feel guilty. He wants to use guilt then to move us to shame, and
right.
shame paralyzes us. God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, wants to bring conviction, okay? Which brings repentance and relationship restoration that empowers us. So Satan's goal is through guilt, shame to disable us, wipe us out, okay? Paralyze us. God over here says, through the power of the Holy Spirit, bring conviction, which brings repentance, restoration of relationship, and it empowers us to be at a different level right after that. And you nailed it when you said the shame issue, we've got to get over that.
Yeah, we could even dedicate a whole podcast series to the topic of shame and how shame not only it debilitates people, but it isolates, right? It creates this culture of I'm at it and I'm doing it by myself. That's really what it comes down to. And
when you get ready to do that, by the way, I have the guy that would be on the podcast with you who deals with that subject with men.
All right, I'll have to contact you about that one. So
there you go.
Moving past shame and moving past guilt, what are some of the ways to get started in terms of investing in others? Maybe some of our listeners today or in the future down the line will say, you know what, I'm not really that invested right now, but I really want to get tied in and invest in some young people, and maybe not just young people, but also maybe men their own age too.
Jay, I love how you transitioned that last statement of yours, because you went from young people and brought it all the way to men our own age. You know, keep in mind at 74, a young man to me is 40s and 50s, right?
My age.
Yeah, your age. Okay. And that's exactly right. So I would give you a couple of keys on this. One is look around, just look around. Okay, that right around you. And in looking around, the second part of this is ask yourself about the people that invested in your life. What kind of people were those? Okay, because I think that's going to tell you a lot about the kind of person that you need to look at yourself as to invest in other lives. Okay, and you can ask yourself, these people, were they perfect? Right? Were they absolutely geniuses and everything? You can go through all this, and no, they weren't. They were everyday people for the most part that made themselves available, sought, captured the moment in your life, and presented themselves in a sense. And the other part that goes with this is you get two schools of thought on mentoring, Jay. One of them is Bob Beal wrote a great book on mentoring, but he's a get a mentor for life kind of guy. I'm in another camp that says I believe very much in seasonal mentors, that it's very possible that stepping into another person's life, your primary role is to develop a level of confidence, and then your job is to guide them to someone else who will take them to that next leg and that next season. And I find that's true with myself a lot. The number of people I've met with, and it's ultimately involved me introducing them to someone else they needed to know.
Kind of passing the baton, to use that
Yeah,
phrase.
well, I don't pass the baton. You know, the book we wrote is If You Passed It, Keep It. We refer to passing the mantle of leadership, that you take this off here and you expand on their relational group that they have. So you're not out of the picture. Okay.
Right.
And very often after they've met with somebody or they've had that, it's very often they would come back and say, hey, by the way, man, that was great. Who else do you know that I would need to meet with? You see what I'm saying? So you're still engaged, but at a different level there.
Now, from personal experience for yourself, what's your typical timeline for meeting with people? I know that's probably very subjective and it ranges case to case or person to person or season to season. But what's your typical average, would you say, from moving singularly or maybe small group wise, investing in people and then moving them into that next step of exposing them to other relationships like what you are speaking of?
Well, let me answer this with a story. A gentleman was playing at a very, very nice country club for the very first time where caddies were required. And he got all through and he asked the caddy and he said, I've never played here before. What's your average tip? And the caddy said, $500. And the guy went, wow. And then the caddy looked at him and he said, now I don't get the average very often. So when you say, what's your average timeline? I don't know, because it's so, I could tell you right now, the gentleman I spoke to you about, and I said, man, here's a guy you need to get. He and I have been meeting, I think it's since 2004. We've got 17 years together. And we still meet regularly. Okay. I can refer to another guy, which by the way, came out of he and I sitting, doing life together. Another guy passed us that we both knew, looked at us, came over, said hello. And we both felt, man, there was something interesting there. Don't know what it was with this guy. And the following day, I got a text from this guy and said, hey, can I call you? Yeah, he calls and he said, listen, yesterday was kind of interesting when I saw the two of you meeting, both of us that knew each other and knew him. And he says, and the moment I saw that and I walked over, God said to me, that's something you don't have in your life.
Wow.
He said, would you meet with me? The guy's 10 years older than I am.
Wow.
And we walked through a season that dealt with some business things. He had remarried and some things like that. And I probably met with him for 6 months, but then it led us to a point that very clearly one of his interests, I could connect him to somebody that could that was the specialty, take him deep there. I still see this man periodically, or I'll hear from him, but we don't meet anymore. And we had about a 6-month window. So I've got 17 years and 6 months. Okay. Somewhere in between there, I guess, would be what you call the average.
There you go.
Okay.
Talk about the importance of not just accountability, but also confidentiality that's involved with the invested life.
Oh, well, let me tell you, that comes into a lot of different forms. So when I'm meeting with a young lady, I want to go to the younger people. Okay. That issue of confidentiality is very, very important with them, but it's also important that the conversations with, for example, their parents. So when I've talked about some of these young ladies, high school, and so forth, I'm very close to their parents as well. And while I tell them I'm very confidential, and I tell them up front, the young ladies, young men, I've got young guys, young all the way across. I won't share this with anybody unless, one, it's against the law or you're putting yourself physically at risk. Okay. If I detect any of that, believe me, we're going to get you some help immediately. Okay. You need to know that. All right. So that kind of sets it. But I've also, with the parents then, in the case of these, so they know I'm not trying to replace them as parents. I'm trying to become an encourager for their child and a different voice. And it helps, interestingly enough, in the book that we wrote, Men of Honor, Women of Virtue, we have an entire chapter on releasing your friends to be your children's friends. So in both of these cases, I knew their parents before I knew them, really. And so through a process. And so confidentiality is very, very important, processing. And I can tell you, in the case of one young lady, she had a major decision she had talked to her mom, but never talked to her dad about. Well, my job wasn't to go to the dad. My job was to encourage her. So in a text just last week, I said, okay, tell me this. Now, have you talked to your dad? And I talked to her about the importance of trust between her and her parents, right? Well, I saw her dad just this week. And she came back, responded, says, yep, me and dad talked. So I talked to her dad and I said, now I can talk to you about it because I just got word from your daughter. She had spoken to you, which was the most important thing. He said, man, that was great. And it was a decision. She needed a letter. And he said, Chuck, I helped her write the letter after she came to me. And, she went through it. So there's things there, confidentiality. Now, if you're dealing with someone that is not under their parents, right? Same rules apply in the sense, if it's against the law or you're putting yourself at risk, believe me, we're going to get you some help on this. Okay. But then the confidentiality portion of that is extremely important, that you can be trusted. Okay. And I would just say to you, in each of these meetings, where are these supposed to go? A great friend, Dan Schaefer, one of the founders of Promise Keepers and president of a ministry called Building Brothers. And, there's things people say to you, you wish you'd have thought of it yourself. But he says, our job is not to give them answers. Our job is to help guide them to the point they ask the question that only God can answer for them.
Mm.
So you think about that, whether it's a young lady here that's 14 years old, or whether it's a guy that's 80 yesterday and so forth, or day before. The real issue is not me providing answers. The real issue is creating a safe environment and culture where I'm encouraging them to ask the question that only God can answer for them.
Yes, that makes sense. Now, you've incorporated those values of confidentiality, of the invested life, right into the ministry, a chosen generation, a chosen people. And why don't you speak to your ministry with that as the founder, as the director? Where is this ministry at right now, and where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
Wow, great question.
Yeah.
So here's what happened. We launched in 1997, basic ministry for doing leadership development in this fledgling thing called Rites of Passage. In 2000, we rebranded to a chosen generation and really focused on the Rites of Passage. But it was shortly thereafter we realized that the Rite of Passage itself was part of a much larger piece, and that was a transformational, intergenerational culture. That God, if you look at the number of times in the Bible, God said from generation to generation and uses that and so forth. And of course, we go to Psalm 78, verses 5-7, where he says, that God gave the law of Jacob to the forefathers, which he commanded them to teach their children, who in turn would teach their children. Even generations yet to be born would arise and teach their children. They would place their trust in God, not forget his command, would obey his commands and not forget his deeds. So trust, remember, and obey is what the three elements are of the legacy there. And so that changed us then to this whole thing of how do we help organizations, churches, understand the need for and then create a transformational intergenerational culture. So it begins with helping understand what's intergenerational, by the way. And so we have to ask that question because very often in a church or an organization with multiple generations, you think you're saying the same thing because you use the word, it's got to mean the same. And I say very often in churches and in organizations with multiple generations contributing to the process, we become like the United Nations without translators. We think because we say it, everybody else hears it and understands it, but they don't. So we talk in terms of there's cross-generational, which is really marketing. You market across generational lines really to maintain market share and longevity of the product or the organization. There is multi-generational, which is really putting, as Whoopi Goldberg says in Sister Act 1, butts in the seats. That's what it's all about. And
Right.
many organizations think because they look into the audience and they say a diversity of culture, a diversity of generations and things like that, they have intergenerational when all they have is multi-generational because everything is center stage focused. Intergenerational has to do with the intentional structure of developing relationships across generational lines for the purpose of growing them as followers of Christ is what we do. So everything I do, whether it's sports, playing golf with a young guy and that process, all of that has to do with or meeting with them about this intergenerational relationship that encourages them to seek to become their purpose, destiny, the mission that God has for them. And then bring them back to this Jay of, man, are you asking the question that only God can answer for you? And part of that means I can't answer some of those questions for him. I have to let God do it and be real quiet.
The notion of silence in relationship is such a unique factor that we so often dismiss because we feel like we have to fill in the empty spaces with some sort of verbiage or some sort of cliche that really diminishes the value of that moment. And I love that you spoke to that. As a communication professor myself at a local college, we are quick to fill in the empty spaces. And we can so easily do that in our relationships too, with the quick catchphrase or, hey, I'll pray for you, or Christian jargon, whatever you want to put in there. And that, again, diminishes the questions. It diminishes the opportunity for the Spirit to speak, I think, when we try to butt our way in to interrupt what the Spirit wants to say in the first place. So
just had this conversation to actually just say, and it was the director of our life groups at my local church. And he talked about not being afraid of the silence, and how many times do you see something on Facebook and they're showing you, but what they're saying is wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, because you want to get ahead. And in fact, to hear, you got to wait for it and it's set up for it. Well, I think so much of it is God. Our son says God uses our setups to set us up. And a lot of times in that process, it's like the Holy Spirit is saying, wait for it, just wait for it. And it's not because I think we feel like if there's a silence, they don't understand. So we've got to clarify it because we want that immediate response and feedback. Very often they understand very clearly and they're processing. And that's when they're going to be asking the question that only God can answer for them.
Yeah, the microwave mentality of Burger King, have it right your way right away is their tagline used to be. So as we wrap up, relationships bring about more relationships.
Yes.
Any closing thoughts that you might want to add as it relates to maybe the books that you've written or have been involved with, Men of Honor, Women of Virtue, or you've contributed with the Effective Men's Ministry, the Men's Bible, as well as other devotionals and other works. What closing thoughts would you have about relationships begetting or bringing about more relationships?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the books and that. Here's what I would say. It's not about our books. I'm here as a guest because I believe so much in CSB and what God is doing in it through that ministry. You can go to our website, www.achosengeneration.org. You can find out everything you need to know about ministry resources. Now put that aside. That the issue on relationships, that God created us as relational beings. And he established that by stating the most primary relationship is with God the Father through Jesus Christ, his son. It's the only way to get to the Father. But he didn't do that to present an obstacle. He actually provided us a pathway for the greatest relationship for an eternity. Well, he did that, I think, and Christ did so much to model how important it is for us as relational beings to have the kinds of relationships that bring honor and glory to God and to help each other grow in the process. So I would just suggest that, you look at relationships and go, just look around. Just look around. Who are the people already in your life? Who are the people that could just use an encouraging word, right? And I'll take you back, and this was 2 weeks ago, meeting with another young person, and she had just bought her own business, works full-time, bought her own business with her cousin. And I listened to her story in that, known her for 20 years. And I said, how can I help you? And she literally got emotional. And emotions aren't bad. Emotions, they're the gauges on the dashboard. They're not the problem or the solution. They're just indicators.
Right.
And I said, I didn't mean to ask you an emotional question. She said, oh, I was just emotional. She says, the problem is nobody really says that to me. I said, how can I help you? And she says, yeah, I don't get that from anybody anymore, or very many. And just that simple question, how can I help you? If there's one thing I can do to further where God is taking you, tell me what I could do to help you. Okay. So sometimes that's really the question. Hey, how you doing? And be ready to listen, and then say, but you know what? Is there any way I can help you? What can I do to help you? So.
And there's something, how quickly, again, back to the communication moment where we always have these exchanges, at least in everyday life. How are you? Good. How are you? Instead of taking that moment to pause and answer. You want to throw someone off their game, answer this way. Do you really want to know?
Exactly right. Great statement,
I gotta
Jay.
go.
Great statement, Jay.
Thanks for tuning into Valor Conversations with your host, Jay Trainer. Valor Conversations is powered by CSB Ministries and is the official podcast of Christian Service Brigade. For more information, please visit csbministries.org. And in the meantime, stay tuned for more Valor Conversations coming your way soon.